morning or good evening or good morning, wherever you are based. My name is Thomas Hickman, and I'm happy to open this webinar. I'm an associate senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Lund University, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this Global Goals webinar on methods for analyzing the steering effects of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, as you might know, this is already the 7th session of our webinar series. And today we discuss the question, or we discuss more generally also which methods are out there to assess the steering effects of the SDGs, of the 17 global goals. And in particular, we will raise the overarching question whether our repertoire or palette of existing methods is adequate to trace the effects that the SDGs have had so far, and how can we project future trends also in the overall achievement of the SDGs until 2030. This is in line also with the presentations of previous co-lead authors. And as you can see on the slide, this is chapter number 6, but we also had the kickoff meeting at the very start of this webinar series, and we will focus on existing knowledge on assessments of indicators and methods. And to address this topic, we have a fantastic panel today. First, we have Prajal Pradhan, who is lead author of this chapter and senior scientist working in the field of climate resilience at the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. Then we have Detlef van Vuuren, who is also lead author of this chapter to be presented today, and senior researcher at PBL, the Environmental Assessment Agency of the Netherlands. And at the same time, Detlef is also professor of integrated assessment of global environmental change at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. Third, we have Birka Wicke, who is the third lead author of this chapter. And she is associate professor of land use and environmental impacts, also at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. And then I'm delighted that we have Fernando Cantu here with us, who has agreed to act as a discussant and reflect on the chapter and presentation. Fernando works at the Department of Policy Research and Statistics at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. And he will later also give us some insights how UNIDO is involved in the assessment of SDG indicators. Before I hand over the floor to the presenters, let me briefly explain the house rules once again. As in our previous sessions of this Global Goals webinar series, only the videos and audios of panelists are available. Then you are invited to ask questions. We most welcome your questions using the chat function at any time, and we will address your questions after the presentation and the reflections by our discussant. And yeah, with that, I'm happy to hand over and to give the floor to Birka, Detlef, and Prajal for the presentation of the key findings of the chapter 7.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, we will together present findings of the chapter, and I will kick off. So maybe you can move to the next slide, Birka. Yeah, so the SDGs have been installed for quite a while now, and so we are almost getting halfway the period that they were installed and the goals that they need to achieve. And so it starts to become a very critical question: did the SDGs lead to anything? The next click. And so what we are doing, in addition to the other chapters in the book that we have written, is that in this chapter we ask ourselves what methods are available to answer that question, which is obviously a quite difficult question. And luckily there are a lot of different methods available, and so we wanted to give some insights on this landscape of methods, and also to describe how they relate to interdisciplinary research and how possibly these methods can be used in combination. Next slide, please, Birka. And yeah, in order to ask the question, to answer the question, did the SDGs lead to anything? Obviously, we need ourselves to ask first, what did the SDGs aim to achieve? And obviously, the preamble of the Sustainable Development Goals does give some answer to this, where they indicate that they more or less want to lead to a much more sustainable development with access to resources for everyone, and peaceful development, and a sustainable development. But the other thing that is clearly in the SDGs is that they want to move to an evidence-based policymaking, and they want to allow to monitor progress, to hold parties accountable, and to some degree inspire people to make that transition. Go to the next. So in the book, this question of did the SDGs lead to anything is actually translated into a terminology of what are the steering effects of the SDGs. And in chapter 1 of the book, it is defined as the influence of behavioral change of political, economic, or societal actors in the long run. Now that analogy of steering effects is actually quite a useful one, because if you want to monitor what a car is doing, you also can look into two things. One is, in what direction is the car moving? And secondly, why is that car moving? Is the car moving randomly in a certain direction, or is somebody really making a change? And that's same type of thinking we can also do with respect to the SDGs. So first of all, what is the progress towards meeting the goals? Are we moving in a direction of less greenhouse gas emissions, consistent with the Paris goals? Are we moving in a direction where we preserve biodiversity? Are we providing access to food for everyone? Are we removing poverty? So you can, on the one hand, monitor the progress towards making the goals, but the second thing is that we can look into, is this actually achieved by the SDGs, or is something completely different, economic development, or leading in a certain direction? And so we have to look at both things. So first of all, are we moving in the right direction? And secondly, are the SDGs making that difference? Now, to do that research is not easy. One complication is that it's quite a comprehensive set. 17 goals, 169 targets, 231 unique indicators. And so that means that we need a method that is able to allow capturing these multidimensional aspects of the NDC, and also look into integrated policymaking. Secondly, it's not only science that's making a difference here, and also not only science that can look into these steering effects. And so somehow we need transdisciplinary research methods where we involve also non-scientific information into the research. The last thing is that the SDGs are to some degree formulated at a global level, but they need to implement it nationally. And so also the methods need to somehow deal with scale. And at this point, I would like to hand over to Birka.
Thanks, Detlef. So I will continue with giving you an overview of the methods that we studied. We included 5 different methods, and Detlef already mentioned that it's a very multifaceted landscape of methods that are available to study the steering effects of the SDGs. And we focused here on 5 different methods that you see illustrated on the slide. There are a few others that I will come back to later in my section. So first, the monitoring approaches that are methods that use historical or current data trends in indicators and indices in order to measure or monitor the progress in attaining the goals, to develop strategies for achieving the goals, or to understand the interlinkages between the different goals or targets. And then the second method or group of methods that we included are the model-based scenario approaches that try to describe the relationship between societal trends such as population growth or economic growth or a change in dietary patterns, and these societal trends and their relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals. And with understanding this relationship, we're able to look into what may be possible in the future in terms of achieving the goals, or what policies and measures do we need to really try to achieve them. The third group of methods are qualitative case studies that look in depth at the adoption of the goals by different actors or institutions and the implications of that adoption. So the purpose is to give a really detailed description of patterns that can be seen in the adoption of the goals or their implications. And it's also possible here to look at different case studies and actually look at find overarching patterns. So to identify enabling conditions or constraints that make it harder to achieve or implement the goals. And actually, many of such case studies are used in the earlier chapters, so in earlier webinars of this series. These qualitative case studies are used to understand what is the progress that we've made so far. The third group of methods is here called network analysis, and the network analysis study tries to understand the relationship between different entities. And here you already see that I split it up in two types. So first, the identification of interactions, so the interactions between goals and targets. And the second one, what we call here governance networks, looks at the connections between different actors that are involved in governing the goals or in implementing the goals. And network analysis is a useful tool to conceptualize, visualize, and also analyze these connections, either between goals and targets or between the different actors that are involved. And then the fifth group of methods is discourse analysis and interpretive approaches. These are methods that study written, spoken, and also sign language to understand how certain concepts and ideas or norms, how they become implemented in the social context. So it's about understanding progress in implementing sustainable development and what may slow it down. Then the question is, well, how did we analyze these methods? And we first looked at what type of steering effect do they actually try to analyze. And Detlef already mentioned that we distinguish two types of steering. One with the yellow border is the studying progress towards the SDGs. And the second one with the green dotted line is studying the impact on the discourse or the decision making. And you see that the two more quantitative approaches, monitoring approaches and model-based scenario approaches, focus on progress towards SDGs, whereas the other three look more on or assess the impact on discourse and decision making. Besides the type of steering effect, we also looked at 4 other dimensions that are relevant for better understanding in how far these methods can actually help us understand the steering effects. And these are temporal scale. So are we looking at current or past trends or future trends, projected future trends? Then the geographical scale methods, some might specialize more on the local level, others on the global level, or somewhere in between. The third dimension is the coverage of goals. So in how far do the methods look at one specific goal, multiple goals, or actually comprehensively try to cover all 17 goals? The fourth dimension then refers to the interactions and interlinkages between the SDGs. And we heard from Detlef already, and I think all of us are also aware of that the SDGs are really an integrated set of objectives. So they interact over scale, over time and space, but also over the sustainability dimensions. So in order to understand the steering effects of the SDGs, we also need to better understand these interlinkages. So then let's look at briefly at what the different methods can actually do in terms of these dimensions. So here I present the temporal scale and how the 5 methods address the temporal scale. And we see the focus is primarily on a retrospective approach, so studying current and past trends, whereas the model-based scenario approaches also try to, actually largely focus on prospective studies, so trying to project what may happen in the future and understand how different policies or measures could affect the future. Then coming to the geographical scale, here you see how most methods actually can address multiple scales, either from local to global or part of that. But what we actually see, and that's what is possible, but what we see in practice is that most methods are actually typically applied only at 1 or 2 of the scales, not at all of them. And here, of course, it says local, national, and global, but of course you can imagine intermediate scales as well. And maybe coming back to that, it's all why this is important is that there's interlinkages also in space, right? That local actions can affect the global and vice versa. Then coming to the third dimension, that's the coverage of the goals. We see that many methods have different strengths in terms of how many goals they can cover. Monitoring approaches are quantitative methods that really are comprehensive in terms of their coverage. And qualitative case studies and discourse analysis can also do the comprehensive coverage. But if we look at model-based scenario approaches, for example, they're really limited to a few goals, and the risk of focusing only on some of the goals and not taking a comprehensive approach is, of course, that we can't reflect the holistic or integrative nature of the SDGs. And so in the future, more comprehensive coverage of the goals is, of course, really important for that. Then the interlinkages as the 4th dimension, we see that many different types of approaches try to understand or have tried to study the interlinkages between goals. And for some, this is even the key focus, like the qualitative case studies or the network analysis. But also other approaches are able to do it. And this is also here important because it's a core paradigm of the SDGs, that they're interlinked. And so we need to have a really good understanding of how these interlinkages work. Then I mentioned previously that these were the 5 main groups of methods that we studied, but that there are also, of course, many other methods and tools that we weren't able to analyze in that much detail. And some examples that we did address briefly in the chapter are participatory research, other quantitative or qualitative forecasting methods such as trend analysis, and then a computational text analysis or quantitative content analysis. And I think here it's also important to mention that these methods, not just the 3 that I mentioned here, but also the 5 others that we discussed in more detail, are often used also in combination. So, for example, participatory research can be input to a modeling study. Besides these scientific methods that we analyzed, we also briefly looked at tools. And with tools, we mean tools that options where we translate the scientific findings in more accessible for non-scientific audience, more accessible results. So making online tools where anybody, policymakers, but also regular citizens can actually look and understand what is happening around the SDGs. So it's both for supporting the decision making and in general for studying the SDGs. So with that, I will hand over to Prajal.
Thank you, Birka. Yep. So when we look at all these tools across different dimensions, we figure out like our chapter can summarize into 5 key messages. The first message is there is no single method can give a comprehensive overview of a steering effect. So far there are many methods that have been used for investigating SDGs. However, the issue is like no single method can look at both the steering effect, and we need such method to look at that. But and one of the important thing here is like there is a need to bring together results of different methods. Mainly interdisciplinary cooperation is needed, and also mixed method approaches are also needed. In a way, this is also not new, because some of the studies definitely uses this mixed method approaches, like combination of network analysis with expert opinion, text mining, or quantitative studies, or statistical analysis integrated with literature review, network analysis, and also models results are also integrated with different methods. And the second key message is on lack of data. When we look at global SDG database, we know that there is one from United Nations, the official one. There is also one from World Bank, and there is also one from Sustainable Development Solution Network. And even these 3 global data set doesn't provide all needed data on SDGs. And this lack of quantitative and also qualitative data complicates SDG research. Especially what we see is like data for at a local level or subnational level is lacking, and also for low income countries we see a lot of missing data set. And then when we look at case studies or qualitative data, studies are more biased towards English literature, and also done mostly on global North. So not only quantitative data, we also need qualitative data to analyze the policy change. So this is one of the key messages here. And the third is when we look at those studies, many methods are used. However, these methods focused on few SDGs, very little methods focused on all SDGs. Many methods can address multiple goals, however, few address all. For example, as Birka already mentioned, qualitative methods, discourse analysis can address all the goals. Some of the quantitative approaches can also address all the goals. However, here the problem is data limitation. Modeling approaches is evolving. So normally models are developed in the context of climate change and land use, energy issues. However, they are also integrating more and more and covering more data set. However, we need to do a bit more there. And here, why we need to cover all the data set, all SDGs, is mainly because of their interlinkages and interlinkages. If we don't cover all SDGs, somewhat there is a risk that we may need we will be missing the interlinkages and interactions from the SDGs, and that's the fourth finding here. So can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and here what we see is like addressing SDG interlinkages is really a crucial issue, because we can see synergies and trade-off across SDGs, and here the coverage of SDG interactions and interlinkages is very limited to qualitative and quantitative analysis. There are models which are also looking at SDG interlinkages. However, they are focusing on few clusters like climate, land, water, food, energy, water nexus. And also what we see is like studies on interactions across time and space and spillover effect of SDGs are also limited. So one of the question here is that how SDG interlinkages can be translated into tangible policy process to facilitate integrated goal achievement. This is really a crucial question, because even though SDG, in terms of formulation of SDGs, interactions are mentioned, but there is no target or there is no indicator to measure that. So the fifth finding is that when we talk about SDGs, now maybe for the next generation of SDGs, we need to talk more about a science-based target. We definitely need to reflect how our SDGs are developed, even though there is a lot of iterative process, a lot of negotiations, exchanges between policy makers, scientists, and different stakeholders. Still, there is a question that whether all these targets are science-based target or policy targets. So what we think, or also what we found in the literature, is like it is also crucial. These global goals, which has potential to steer social, environmental, and economic system, need to be a bit more science-based. Saying that, I would like to wrap up with mainly the 2 points here. The first main message is like we don't have any single method that can comprehensively study all SDG steering effect. The second one is we need different methods to understand these steering effect properly. So we definitely need to build bridges across different communities, and also promote scientific evidences in science policy interference. So we would like to thank you very much for your attention here. So yeah.
Thank you, Birka, Detlef, and Prajal, for this presentation, the key findings. And as you know, of course, the chapter will soon be available, open access, in a couple of weeks. We will later on also tell you how to access this. And now we're looking forward to Fernando's reflection on these key insights. And you had the pleasure already to take a deeper look at the proofs of the chapter. So you have read the chapter, and looking forward to your comments.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here to give my my reflections on this great chapter. So let me start by just giving you a very brief background of UNIDO and the work that we do here. So UNIDO is the UN Organization for Industrial Development. And in terms of our work on the SDGs, we are custodians of several SDG indicators, especially on SDG 9. So what I mean with custodians means that we're really responsible for the development of these indicators, to propose new methodologies, and also to work together with the countries to improve data availability and reporting on these indicators. Because as it was repeatedly today, there is really some problems with the availability of data. So as part of our work as custodians of these SDG 9 indicators, we contribute to the global efforts to build this, the global database that Prajal mentioned, and other initiatives. And we have our own products. We have our own database, we have our own report, we have our own SDG 9 index, we have some outlook indicators. So all these are in the classification proposed by the authors. That are more like monitoring, going to the monitoring approach or model-based approach. But we also work a lot with countries. We have a lot of country diagnostics, let's say, or a lot of country programs, where we really try to advocate for the use of the SDG 9 and the related concepts as a guide, let's say, or as a way to guide policy. And as part of that, we also produce a lot of analytical work at the country level. So this will be more on the kind of case study, qualitative case studies that the author mentioned. So as part of this work that we do in terms of SDG, it's I must confess that it's getting a bit overwhelming and more every day, in the sense that every day there seems to be a new report, a new index, a new dashboard, a new something, and we're constantly proposing new things. So we're also contributing to this kind of overload of information. So it's sometimes kind of difficult to organize or to find some structure in this in all this information. So and I think the chapter does a great work on proposing or we'll not say a classification, but yeah, I mean it's almost a classification on the different approaches that can be used to study the effects of the SDGs. So it's a great synthetic effort, and not only that, so they did that not by going initiative by initiative, because there are thousands, but just by proposing general approaches that can be used to study the SDGs, and then giving their characteristics, their dimensions, their challenges, their limitations, and also by proposing that not a single one, as was mentioned in the conclusion, not a single one can be used as can give an entire overview of what's happening. We really need a multidisciplinary approach, really a diversity of methods. So one of the things that I really liked about the chapter is when we work with the SDGs, it's actually when we work with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, sometimes this gets reduced to just the SDGs. Sometimes it's even more, it's just the indicators. So the indicators become the objective, right? But in reality, there's so much more to the 2030 Agenda, and by recognizing in their two types of steering effects, that there's not only a progress towards the goals, but also how they affect policy and agenda setting. I think they recognize of this kind of comprehensiveness of the 2030 Agenda that includes all these means of implementations at different levels. It includes all these partnerships. So I think that's something I was very happy when I was reading that. Also, and when you read the chapter, you will notice that every 2 paragraphs, they mention something about interdependence or about interlinkages. And this, it's again, but really because this is the core of the 2030 Agenda, that you cannot just look at the different goals or the different dimensions separately. It all has to be seen as a network, as a comprehensive, holistic set. And achieving one can influence positively, kind of a virtuous circle, can affect the others, but it can also have, there can also be some trade-offs. So this is something that has to be always recognized. Another thing that I liked a lot about the chapter, and it was clear in the presentation, was the role of science and evidence-based policy making, which it's very important, and it has always been at the core of the SDGs. Of course, the process was long and it required a lot of input from a lot of different actors in many levels. So this kind of got a bit diluted, but you can still recognize how a lot of the goals are really based on science, and how there's really an emphasis on the interactions between the different elements, and of course the role of statistics and indicators, that also comes from there. So I think this is very positive. Of course, the authors then recognize that there are limits to this, because of course there's some important data gaps. There's still a lot of things that science still doesn't provide a clear answer on how, especially when you talk about these kind of high dimensional interactions between the goals. And also because a lot of this science can be very complex, so it's really a challenge to translate it into something that can be followed by everyone. So this is something that I also like. I also like how, because of this huge complexity, and what I mentioned before, that there's really no one single method that can be used. That we really need to take a mixed method approach and balance between the advantages and limitations of each of the methods. And then, of course, I'm a statistician. I work in the statistics division. So for me, the main part is of my work is obviously the work on data. So yeah, this is a great. There has been a lot of progress. When we started with the 2030 Agenda, we didn't even have the indicators. Now it's really like everyone is rallying to improve data availability, but there's still huge gaps. And also, and as I was mentioning in the presentation, the distribution of data is not equal. There is skewed towards richer countries or countries that have better statistical systems, or within the countries, it's also skewed towards urban centers or certain population groups or men, let's say, sometimes. So when you draw conclusions, or not only the data doesn't sometimes allow you to draw conclusions, but also when it does, it can be biased, because the data that you're using for your analysis, it doesn't have a complete coverage. So it's really an important part of the SDGs on how we improve data availability, data coverage, data quality. So and we're doing our best, but there's so much to do. So and just to conclude, I wanted to maybe ask a few questions to the authors. maybe also this can open and bring some more questions from the participants, hopefully. So, I mean, are not specific questions on one method or the other. It's more about how we can use the methods to study the effects of the impact of the SDGs. So one is, when we work with the SDGs, we very frequently get the criticism that they're great for advocacy, or as was mentioned, as an inspiration to inspire, but they're too high level, they're too aggregate, so they're really difficult to use them for policy making, to monitor development, to evaluate specific policy programs. So it would be great to know what you think about how the different methods can be used to evaluate if this is true or not, if they really have contributed or are contributing to this, or they're mostly used just as a kind of a communication, advocacy, maybe inspiration material, or they have really had some effect on guiding policy and then evaluating the policy. Another important thing, also from the point of view of statistics, and you mentioned this when you talk about the qualitative case studies, is that we always have the problem of internal validity, right? So you see that the steering wheel is pointed in a certain direction, but how can you tell if it's because of the SDGs or just because there's so many other factors unobserved or that we don't have at our disposal? And this is a very difficult question, and I think this affects not only the case studies, but it affects all of the methods. So how do you think the methods can I mean, do you think some of the methods are better or not at providing information, at really identifying the effects of the SDGs, the causal effects of the SDGs, or how can we use them for that, which for us is very important as well to be able to say this. And then finally, as you know, any kind of shocks can have an important effect on the goals, not only on the progress that we're making toward the goals, but also by let's say affecting decision making by changing priorities or changing diverting resources. And this, of course, we saw the largest example is, of course, COVID-19, but we see this every time there's some sort of natural disaster or a conflict or maybe a financial crisis. Just a lot of the actions and everything that was achieved kind of goes a bit backwards, and then it's even more difficult to disentangle these effects of the shocks. So which one of the different approaches do you think will be better suited to study the effects of shocks, and what factors do you think we need to consider? So with these three questions, I think that's it from my side, and I look forward to the discussion and any other comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. Wonderful. Thanks for the comprehensive reflection on the chapter, and also for these challenging and clear questions directed to the presenters. And I will directly give the floor back to the presenters to briefly answer these questions. Up to you.
Detlef, you want to start with the first question?
Okay. Yeah, so the first question was, are the SDGs mostly inspiration, and or can they really be used also in a pragmatic sense, or are they formulated to an abstract level? And I think I would like to compare it with climate policy. And in climate policy, obviously, the UNFCCC treaty, first of all, indicates that we want to prevent dangerous climate change. And so there is a very aggregated formulation as an inspiration of where we want to go. Then that was translated into, if we want to prevent dangerous climate change, that needs to be this 1.5 to 2 degrees. And then we have a lot of research trying to translate it again into even more tangible targets, like, for instance, okay, emission reduction in 2030 need to be 25 to 50%. And then the next step is that you start asking yourself, what does it mean for my company? And so, and how does my company fit into that particular 25% emission reduction? And so I think that is a step that we need to take with the SDGs as well. And unfortunately, we haven't come that far yet. And so the SDGs are perfect, first of all, at that level of indicating the overall goals. Some of the indicators have made a nice, in the targets, nice attempt to try to make it a bit more concrete. But we still need studies that take these goals and, for instance, do scenario analysis of showing how to achieve these goals, and not only one by one, but as a set, and also look into the interactions. And that would allow us then to more concretely judge whether actions of particular companies are in line with meeting the SDGs, or particular countries, or not. And so I would really argue that we need to take the example of climate change and also biodiversity really as an example, and then try to go in the same way for the SDGs. The second question, do you have a suggestion of who starts there, Birka? Or do you do as some of the other authors want to add something to the first question?
Yeah, I think what I would add to the first question is just that sorry. The high level characteristic of the SDGs is indeed a criticism, but at the same time it also has a positive benefit, and Detlef hinted at it, but I'd like to make that a bit more specific, that because it is so broad, it also allows many actors and institutions to feel represented, or to be able to align with it and say, I sign up to this, I also believe in this. Of course, that can come with a risk of greenwashing or cherry picking, that you only pick some of the goals. But it also may be a reason why it has such a big momentum. So I would say that, yes, I totally agree, it's a criticism, or it's a critical aspect, but it can also be a positive thing. Given time, I would like to move to the second question, and I will give it a start, and then Prajal and Detlef can add to that. And the question is about internal validity and whether that's relevant for all other methods. So you mentioned specifically the qualitative case studies, and how different methods can deal with that, and actually maybe more specifically isolate the effect, the contribution of the goals. Indeed, this is relevant for all methods, and actually this is a reason why, or an additional reason why it's useful to look at multiple methods, right? So not only using one method, a group of methods, but actually approaching the topic from various different angles. So to be able to give that comprehensive overview. So I think that would be this one part of the answer. Then if you look at how which specific methods can actually do it, so to identify the causal impact, the two quantitative approaches that we looked at, I think have it maybe a little bit easier to do so. So the modeling studies that are based on scenarios can run scenarios with and without the goals. And by that, looking at the difference between them, they can attribute what is the effect of the goals. The monitoring approaches are also able to identify causal effects. But of course, that's in theory, and in practice, always there are different initiatives interact. And they will enhance each other or slow each other down in different stages, or even at the same time. And so in practice, I think it will continue to remain extremely difficult to pinpoint the exact contribution of the definition of the goals to any progress that we're making. And this is also what the overall finding of the book is, that we are observing change, but in how far this is causally linked to the SDGs is extremely difficult to identify. So I believe there will be one more webinar, and I expect the editors to come back to that point in more detail.
Yeah, thank you. So let me take this question as well. So Yeah, so I would like to add one more method here in the list that Birka mentioned. So one can also do this trend analysis before 2015, how it was, and then what happened in the trend after 2015, and if there is a changes in that trend or not. But for me, the most important question is like the objective of SDGs are to transform into a sustainable world. And we are talking about this from 1970s, yeah, more than 50, 60 years from now. And if we manage to achieve there, I think that's the main point there. And like if we manage to achieve there, then I think that's really a good. So it's a bit like in climate change or climate impact, there is this attribution problem, loss in divisions and attribution, and that is quite crucial there, because who is responsible? But here, since we are going in the right direction, our goal is a sustainable world, then I think personally for me it doesn't matter. And we have to also look at the momentum, like mostly in terms of like low income countries or developing countries, there is a huge momentum towards sustainable development that is coming from Millennium Development Goals. Yeah, and we can also see many of these things have coming up there. And one of the crucial questions would be whether SDGs adoption of SDGs try to accelerate those momentum or not. If those momentum has or those direction hasn't been accelerated, then that's a problem. But if that is accelerated, and if you are going to that direction, then yes, all those compounding factor is needed, and that's really a good. So I would not care much about that. So Detlef, I would like to hand over to you for the next question.
Very quickly, then we can open the floor also for the questions.
Yeah, so this is the last question on the shocks. And so are these are particular methods potentially more open to be used for shocks like COVID? And yeah, I think it's an intriguing question. I think in principle, they all have their benefits and drawbacks, and maybe some of the more quantitative methods have the analysis that they can also try to estimate the quantitative impact of the shock. The more qualitative methods often have the higher degree of flexibility, because they depend less on the existence of a model, for instance, and therefore could potentially more easily be adapted to that specific shock. Often, it will not be so easy to look into a particular shock, simply because it would be so different from the things that you had considered in developing your method. But still, I think if we have a lot of information, we can still use that information to make more assessments of what that shock could mean. And just take the example of the SDGs, the COVID crisis. There were no methods that could easily estimate the impact of the COVID crisis on greenhouse gas emissions. But because there were greenhouse gas emission scenarios, people could at least look into, okay, what is the residential energy use, what's the projected transport energy use, make an estimate of changes that could happen in transport, and then use that information that was available to make a better assessment. Also, the shock now, for instance, with the current war in Europe, again, we can potentially use scenario analysis and information on dependency of Western Europe for gas imports from different parts of the world to make some estimate of what things would mean. And so the same is true for the SDGs. I think making sure that we have a broad mass of information available allows us also to more creatively interpret what that information means in the context of a particular shock.
Yeah, thanks for your answers. Very comprehensive as well. And yeah, we have time for questions from the audience. And since we had the opportunity, you can also simply raise your hand, your virtual hand, and we could even give you the floor for your question. And to break the ice, I would also like to start with one question while I see also another question. But let me ask this first question to all three presenters, and maybe also to Fernando, because you all mentioned that there's no perfect methodology, and that it's important to build bridges between these different methodology camps or communities. that often work in isolation. What are your suggestions how to build these bridges? What are your ideas to bring communities together? That's the first question, and then we will continue with the question from the chat, but maybe you can give a quick answer to this first question. Whoever wants to be first on this.
Would you like to start, Birka? Prajal?
Yeah, I can try. Yeah, so let's put it in this way. We don't need to make breeds everywhere. Nah? So it depends upon the research question. So it doesn't mean like we need to combine all the methods together. Yeah, so that's also not the objective, because if you combine every method together, then maybe it's not possible to operate or apply those methods. But definitely, for example, like since I'm doing more like a quantitative database analysis, looking at SDG interactions. Yeah, so when we use this SDG data from statistical approaches, we can show that there are interactions. There are positive or negative correlations, which can be translated into synergies and trade-off. However, the statistical analysis doesn't necessarily mean that there is a causal link. And this analysis can be backed up by literature review or case studies, which are already there, a lot of case studies. And by doing some sort of like a systematic literature review or systematic evidence synthesis, we can try to figure out what are the mechanisms behind these interactions. So combining statistical analysis with literature review, one can understand the mechanism, and by understanding this mechanism, one can go a bit next step further and build the network of SDGs, looking at causal relationships. Now, and then this could be some sort of like a system dynamic model where we can see that, okay, why some things work and why not something doesn't work. Like what are the actions in past that work towards achieving or making progress in certain SDGs, and why certain thing doesn't work. Yeah, so this could be one example there. No? So combining statistical analysis, evidence synthesis, network analysis, and system dynamic models. Yeah, there could be other set of work that could be done in other scenarios. No? So but we don't mean like all methods need to be combined. It depends upon the research question we want to ask. No?
Yeah, maybe a quick question I could answer as well. And so most of our scientific life we spent in silos. I go to conferences where we meet modelers, the Integrated Assessment Modeling Conference. And no doubt, people working on political science mostly go to political science conferences. And so just organizing more SDG interdisciplinary conferences. For instance, the EU organizing potentially calls in the context of Horizon Europe, where it directly indicates that this needs to be done with a multidisciplinary approach, looking both into the biophysical aspects and political science aspects. And there are different ways that we can make the system also award interdisciplinary cooperation, and just being aware that there are these other approaches. Because actually, when you asked me originally to be part of this book, I immediately thought, okay, this is going to be about model-based scenario analysis, never thinking that there are so many other interpretations of that, how to look at the steering effects.
Yes, I mean, from an optimistic perspective, you could argue that there could be a division of labor between these different methods, also including indicators, I guess, which maybe hopefully this chapter has provided some solid foundation for such a future, hopefully, division of labor. Let me continue with one question from the chat, and maybe it's directed to Birka. It's because you haven't answered this question, so maybe you want to answer this question about one specific method. The question is from Montserrat from Amsterdam. Simulation models are commonly used to address questions on SDG interlinkages from a biophysical perspective. The question is, what's the potential of this methodology in studying the governance dimension of SDGs implementation? Birka, you would like to go for this?
I would like to go for it. I don't have an immediate answer, I have to say. simulation models are very quantitative models generally, right? Or the biophysical simulation models, at least. So the question is, could you learn from that? I think from our book, the network analysis approaches, I think, are quite interesting here for studying the governance dimensions. As I mentioned, one of the network analysis types is looking at how different actors and institutions interact or are linked to each other. And so the question is, could that be linked to some kind of approach where you could say, what if one actor behaves differently? So maybe we could think about agent-based modeling here as a potential approach. But I don't have a very good or immediate answer here. Maybe Detlef, you can contribute.
Go it as well. So clearly models work really nicely for biophysical questions, because you have the natural laws to work on, and often in biophysical systems, the behavior of the past is also indicative of the behavior of the future. So that makes it relatively easy to model them. And that means that SDG 13, SDG 14, SDG 15, and also the climate, biodiversity, the one on energy, the one on land use. There's lots that you can do there with modeling. Unfortunately, that's not the whole agenda. We also want to really address the interactions with the other SDGs. And I do think that we can do much more, although it will be more difficult, because for things like governance, not necessarily with the things that we have observed in the past are automatically also guidance of what will happen in the future. Sometimes even we don't want the things that happened in the past to be happening in the future. But still, there are some relationships that we can understand. So if we, for instance, know that governance works better for educated, in the case that for a more educated population, then obviously, if we have some correlations there, then we can start looking into, okay, if you want to achieve the education goal, how many years of investment into education is needed, how much investment is needed for that. Similarly, there are other indicators that we can relate to governance. So we published a paper this year in One Earth where we tried to set up indicators that would be potentially indicative for achieving the SDGs, 2 per SDG. And we also took deliberately a try at some of the SDGs that where normally you wouldn't think of modeling. So like SDG 16, 17, and the other goals. And I think this is an area where we obviously still need to expand, but I think we will have to do it. It makes it much stronger, these scenarios.
Yeah, let me add something here as well now. So I also think that in a way, part of those governance and policy are also there in the integrated assessment models in a way. So like carbon budget is a governance issue now, how to distribute the carbon budget across different populations. Now, when you talk about SDG 4, there is the scenario of not only about the population, but this scenario is also about fertility. It's also about education attainment, all those things. Now, so also governance is also about like how you distribute the resources. So partly it's there now, and as Detlef, as you mentioned, now we need to work a bit more there, and then we need to act a bit more holistic. So definitely there is potential, and we need to work more, and we definitely need like such project forcing or encouraging collaboration between natural science, social science for joint model development.
Thanks very much. Time is progressing, but I still have one question, one final question. I think that's also directed to Fernando, because you also, Fernando, mentioned in your reflection of the chapter the importance of the use of scientific evidence and evidence-based policymaking. What are, in your view, the main challenges of a more science-based approach to the SDGs?
Okay, so I would say the first one, well, there are several, let's say, limitations or challenges. first is that there is a critical lack, as was mentioned before several times, a critical lack of data. So there's a lot of things that we don't know how to measure. There's not even, actually, if you remember when the SDGs started, even now, there were 3 tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 3, which were about half of the indicators, meant that there was not even an agreed definition of the indicator, right? So if there's no definition, of course, there's no data collection. There's nothing there. So the first big limitation is this lack of internationally agreed data that is collected systematically and that can be segregated and that can be used to track. And also, another problem is that the system is so complex that there's a lot of questions that the science does not have a clear answer. Yes, we can get something from simulation models or from many other tools, scientific tools that are used, but these are not perfect. They can only provide part of the answer, and there's a lot of things we don't know and that we're kind of discovering as policies are implemented in this area. And then, of course, and this is something that also a bit answers your first question on how you link communities. And this is that at the end, when you work in one area, in a small silo, for in my case is statistics, we kind of talk in a specific language, right? So it's very then difficult to communicate or with the other communities. And this applies, I think, in general to all of us. I mean, at the end, the people that we need to convince and that they need to then use these insights from science to implement policies. A lot of the times they don't understand complex models or these very, I don't know, high dimensional questions. They want something clear. So it's also an important part of our work is how to communicate with results with or work with different audiences. I think that it's another important challenge.
Yeah, thanks very much. Any quick additions from the other panelists, from the other speakers? Thanks. Thanks very much for a great panel discussion. And yeah, I'm looking very much forward to the publication of this chapter. As I said, in about 5 to 6 weeks, we are in the final process of this publication. And let me quickly share the screen to also announce this final session of the Global Goals Webinar Series and the book launch in May. The exact date of this book launch is still to be announced because we would like to link it with the publication of the book. It will be open access, so it will be accessible online, but also as a hard copy that's not for free, but the digital file, electronic file, is available to all people in the world, and we hope that you can make use of it. And yeah, I thank very much again Birka, Detlef, and Prajal, and of course also Fernando for your inputs to the discussion. And thanks also to Blake, who is the technical facilitator of this series. And then, of course, also thanks to the audience. Thank you for your attention and for your questions. And we look very much forward to welcome you to the last session then of this webinar series. And as you will know, we will make our announcement via Twitter, also via email, and you will hear from us. Thank you very much for this afternoon, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Fernando.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.